The winter of 1892 carved its cruelty deep into the bones of New York's Lower East Side. Snow didn't fall here. It collapsed, heavy and gray, mixing with coal smoke and the breath of 10,000 desperate souls packed into tenements that groaned under the weight of broken dreams. In this maze of brick and shadow, where hope came measured in pennies and warmth was a luxury few could afford, Sarah Levin pressed her children closer to her body as the wind howled through the cracks in the makeshift shelter they called home. She was 26, though the streets had aged her beyond her years. Her husband David had been gone 8 months now, taken by the fever that swept through the garment district like a plague, leaving behind debts that swallowed their small apartment and forced them into this corner between 2 brick walls, this alcove that offered barely enough space for 3 bodies to huddle together. Her son Yassel, 8 years old with eyes too serious for his age, held his sister Hannah tight against his chest. The 5-year-old had stopped crying days ago, which frightened Sarah more than the tears ever had. The coal barrel glowed red in the darkness, its warmth extending perhaps 3 feet before surrendering to the bitter cold. Sarah had traded her wedding ring for that barrel and enough coal to last a week. Now, as she heated the small kettle over the flames, she calculated in her mind how many more days they could survive. The hot water would go to the children first, it always did. They would drink it slowly, letting it warm their bellies, while she pretended she wasn't hungry, pretended the gnawing in her stomach was just worry, not starvation. People passed by their corner throughout the night. Other immigrants, other survivors, each carrying their own weight of sorrow. An old Italian man with a cough that sounded like breaking glass. A Chinese woman with bound feet, moving carefully through the snow with packages balanced on her shoulders. A group of Irish dock workers, faces red from whiskey and cold, their voices loud and rough as they stumbled home from the taverns. None of them stopped. In this neighborhood, everyone understood the unspoken rule. You minded your own survival because you barely had enough strength for that. Sarah had learned to read the streets, to know which shadows meant safety and which meant trouble. She could tell by the sound of footsteps whether someone was desperate enough to take the little they had, or tired enough to leave them alone. Tonight, the footsteps were different, measured, deliberate, not the shuffle of the defeated or the quick pace of someone with somewhere to go. These steps belonged to someone who was walking with purpose but not in a hurry. Yassel looked up at his mother, his dark eyes reflecting the coal fire. "Mama," he whispered in Yiddish. "Is Papa watching us?" Sarah's throat tightened. She had tried to explain death to him, tried to find words that would comfort without lying. But how do you tell a child that his father is gone forever when you're not even sure you believe in forever anymore? "Yes, my heart," she whispered back, smoothing his dark hair. "He's watching, and he's proud of how brave you are." It was all she could offer, a hope that felt as fragile as the ice forming on the windowsill above them, but it was something to hold onto in the darkness. The footsteps stopped somewhere nearby. Sarah tensed, pulling both children closer, her hand moving instinctively to the small knife hidden in her coat pocket. In the Lower East Side, kindness was rare, but predators were common. She had learned to trust nothing and no one, because survival meant being prepared for the worst of human nature. But sometimes, in the midst of all that stone and smoke, something unexpected could emerge from the shadows. Part 2. Meeting in the Tramway Fog, 3,500 characters. Liam O'Connor walked through the fog that rolled off the East River like the breath of ghosts, thick and gray and tasting of salt and coal smoke. The tramway bells clanged somewhere in the distance, muffled by the mist that turned the familiar streets of his neighborhood into something foreign and dreamlike. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his bones after another sleepless shift watching over the Morrison Brothers warehouse on the docks. At 34, Liam had the hands of a man who'd worked hard all his life, scarred from his years as a firefighter, calloused from loading cargo, steady despite the tremor that came when he'd had too much whiskey the night before, which was most nights if he was honest with himself. The bottle helped quiet the voices that came in the small hours before dawn, the memories that crawled out of the shadows when the city finally fell silent. 2 years ago, Bridget had been everything that mattered. Red hair that caught the light like copper pennies, a laugh that could fill their small apartment above Murphy's grocery store with warmth even on the coldest winter nights. She died in the tenement fire on Hester Street, the same fire he'd fought as one of the city's firemen, the same fire where he'd arrived too late to save the one person who mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on him. All those people he'd pulled from burning buildings, all those lives he'd saved, and he couldn't save the woman who shared his bed and his dreams. Now he worked nights because the darkness suited him. The warehouse job paid enough to keep his small apartment and buy the whiskey that helped him sleep, and it kept him away from people during the day when their conversations and laughter reminded him too much of what he'd lost. He walked the same route home every morning, through Chinatown where the early vendors were setting up their stalls, past the synagogue where old men gathered to argue about scripture, under the arch of the old stone bridge where the homeless sometimes sheltered. That's where he saw them. At first, he thought it was just another pile of rags abandoned by someone who'd moved on to better shelter. But then he saw the small movement, the way the fabric shifted with breathing, and he realized it was a woman with 2 children huddled against the cold stone of the bridge's foundation. The fog swirled around them, and for a moment, Liam felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Not quite compassion, but something close to it, a recognition of suffering that matched his own. He stopped walking and stood there in the gray morning light, watching the woman's careful movements as she tended to her children. She was young, he could see that much, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever pins had once held it in place. The children pressed close to her, seeking warmth, and even from a distance he could see the way her body curved protectively around them, the way she gave them what little she had while keeping nothing for herself. Liam had walked past many people in need since Bridget's death. The streets were full of them. Immigrants, widows, men who'd lost their jobs when the factories closed, children whose parents had been claimed by disease or accident. He'd learned to look away, to keep walking, because stopping to help meant acknowledging that the world was full of pain, and he had enough of his own to carry. But something about this woman and her children made him pause. Maybe it was the careful way she moved, the dignity she maintained even in desperate circumstances. Maybe it was the way the older child, a boy of maybe 8, kept watch while his mother tended to what looked like a younger sister. There was no begging, no calling out for help, just quiet endurance, the kind that spoke of people who had known better times and hoped to see them again. The fog shifted, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Hers were dark and wary, the eyes of someone who had learned not to trust kindness because it usually came with a price. But there was something else there too, a flicker of the person she had been before whatever circumstances had brought her to this bridge, this moment, this desperate measure of survival. Liam found himself walking toward them before he had consciously decided to do so. His footsteps echoed off the stone, and he saw the woman tense, pulling her children closer. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough away to show he meant no immediate threat. "Morning," he said simply, his Irish accent softened by years in New York but still noticeable in the early quiet. The woman nodded slightly but didn't speak. The boy looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "Cold night," Liam continued, not sure what he was doing but unable to walk away. "You been here long?" Again, no response, but he could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was weighing the risk of conversation against the possibility that he might represent some kind of help. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, accented with something European, German maybe, or Yiddish. "We manage," she said, and there was pride in those 2 words, a refusal to be pitted even in the depths of whatever had brought her here. Liam nodded, understanding that pride because he carried his own version of it. "I live nearby," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Above the shop on Rivington Street. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's room enough." The offer hung in the air between them like the fog, unexpected and dangerous in its implications. Liam wasn't sure why he'd said it, wasn't sure what impulse had moved him to extend kindness to strangers when he'd been so careful to insulate himself from human connection. But looking at these 3 people huddled against the stone, he saw something of himself in their careful endurance, their determination to survive whatever had been taken from them. Part 3. Strangers under one roof, 3,500 characters. Sarah stared at the Irish stranger for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities and dangers. In the 8 months since David's death, she had learned to read the intentions behind kind words, to recognize the difference between genuine help and the sort of charity that came with unspoken expectations. Men who offered shelter to desperate women usually wanted something in return, something she was not willing to give. But this man's eyes held a sadness that matched her own, and there was something in his posture, the way he kept his hands visible, the respectful distance he maintained, that suggested his offer might be genuine. Yassel shifted beside her, his small body trembling with cold despite the blanket wrapped around him. Hannah had developed a cough in the night, the kind of wet, rattling sound that Sarah recognized from the tenements where tuberculosis spread like wildfire through families who had no choice but to live pressed together in airless rooms. The decision was made for her by the sound of her daughter's labored breathing and the blue tinge around her son's lips. "For the children," she said finally, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "Just until the weather breaks." It was important to maintain some boundaries, some sense that this was temporary, that she was not abandoning her independence entirely. Liam nodded, understanding the conditions implicit in her acceptance. "Just for the children," he agreed, though they both knew the weather in February might not break for weeks. The walk to his apartment took them through streets that were just beginning to stir with the early morning activity of a city that never truly slept. Vendors wheeled carts of bread and milk toward their corners. Shopkeepers raised the iron gates that protected their windows, and the first shift of factory workers walked past with lunch pails and weary expressions. Sarah kept the children close, one hand on Yassel's shoulder, the other supporting Hannah, who had grown frighteningly light in recent weeks. Liam's building was narrow and unremarkable, squeezed between a cobbler's shop and a bakery whose ovens had already begun to fill the street with the smell of rising dough. He led them up 2 flights of stairs that creaked under their combined weight, past doors behind which she could hear the sounds of other lives. Crying babies, muffled arguments, the scrape of chairs on wooden floors. His apartment was larger than she had expected, though sparsely furnished in the way of a man who had stopped caring about comfort. There was a coal stove that radiated blessed warmth, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in properly for some time. But it was clean, and it was warm, and when Hannah stopped shivering for the first time in days, Sarah felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. "Children can take the bed," Liam said, already moving toward the stove to add more coal. "I'll make up the floor. Done it before." There was no self-pity in his voice, just the practical tone of someone stating facts. Sarah wanted to protest, to maintain some semblance of proper boundaries, but Yassel had already guided his little sister toward the bed, and Hannah's eyes were closing as soon as her head touched the pillow. For the first time in weeks, her children would sleep warm and safe, and that reality overrode every other consideration. "I can cook," Sarah offered, needing to contribute something, to not be entirely dependent on this stranger's charity. "And clean. I'm good with mending." She gestured toward the worn places in his shirt, the frayed edges of the curtains, the general neglect that spoke of a man who had stopped taking care of his surroundings. Liam looked around his apartment as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time, noticing the dust on the windowsill, the pile of unwashed dishes, the general air of abandonment that had settled over his life like dust. "Haven't had much use for keeping house," he admitted. Bridget was the one who. He stopped, the name hanging in the air between them like an explanation and an apology. Sarah understood. David's name still caught in her throat sometimes, still made her reach for words that would never come easily. "How long?" she asked gently. 2 years come spring." Liam pulled a pot from a shelf and began filling it with water from a pitcher. "You? 8 months." The numbers felt inadequate to measure the weight of loss, the way grief reshaped time into before and after, the way it made every day both endless and too short. They moved around each other carefully in the small space, establishing an unspoken rhythm of coexistence. Liam heated soup while Sarah arranged the children's few belongings, creating small spaces of familiarity in this strange new shelter. She found herself noticing details about him, The way he moved quietly to avoid waking the children, the care with which he handled the chipped bowls, the fact that he gave the children the largest portions and ate very little himself. When Yassel woke briefly and asked for water, Liam brought it to him along with a pair of woolen socks that were far too large but wonderfully warm. "These were mine when I was smaller," he lied easily, and Sarah recognized the kindness in the deception. They were clearly his current socks, probably his only extra pair, but the lie allowed Yassel to accept them without shame. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, Sarah found herself watching this quiet man who had taken them in without question or condition. He was reading to Hannah from a book of Irish fairy tales, his voice soft and patient as she interrupted with questions, and there was something in his face when he looked at the children that suggested he had once hoped for some of his own. The apartment fell quiet as evening approached, filled with the simple sounds of people sharing space, the crackle of coal in the stove, the soft whisper of pages turning, the peaceful breathing of children who were finally, for the first time in months, truly safe and warm. Outside, the city continued its relentless noise and motion, but inside these four walls, three strangers had found something that felt dangerously close to home. Part 4. Beginning of something new. 3,500 characters. The rhythm of their shared days developed slowly, like a song being composed one note at a time. Liam continued his night shifts at the warehouse, leaving each evening as the sun disappeared behind the tenement rooftops and returning in the gray hours before dawn to find Sarah already awake, quietly preparing what breakfast they could afford from their combined meager resources. She had a gift for making something substantial from almost nothing: watery soup enriched with bones begged from the butcher, bread stretched with milk to feed 3 people instead of 1, tea that somehow tasted like comfort even when it was mostly hot water flavored with hope. Yassel had taken to following Liam around during the precious few hours when the man was awake and home. The boy seemed fascinated by Liam's careful, methodical way of approaching tasks. The way he mended a broken chair leg with infinite patience. The way he could coax warmth from a reluctant coal stove. The way he spoke to everyone they encountered on the street with the same quiet respect, regardless of their station or appearance. It was a different kind of masculinity than Yassel had known with his father, who had been quick and passionate and full of grand dreams that never quite materialized. Liam's strength was steadier, more contained, like a deep well that could be drawn from endlessly without running dry. Sarah watched this developing relationship with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She was grateful that her son had found a male figure to admire and emulate, someone who treated him with the serious attention that boys crave and rarely receive. But she was also aware of how much Yassel was beginning to depend on Liam's presence, how the boy's face would light up when he heard familiar footsteps on the stairs, how he saved up small observations and questions throughout the day to share during their brief evening conversations. Hannah, meanwhile, had begun to bloom in the warmth and safety of the apartment. Her cough had disappeared within a week of regular meals and steady heat, and her natural curiosity was reasserting itself after months of being subdued by hunger and cold. She followed Sarah around during the day, helping with small tasks and chattering in the way that 5-year-olds do when they feel secure enough to fill silence with their thoughts and observations. It was Hannah who brought about the first real moment of joy they had shared. Liam had been attempting to move a heavy trunk that contained his few remaining possessions from his life with Bridget, trying to make more space in the small apartment. The trunk had been positioned awkwardly near the window, and in his effort to maneuver it around the table, he had somehow gotten it wedged between the wall and a chair in such a way that it couldn't move forward or backward. Sarah and Yassel had watched his increasingly frustrated attempts to free the trunk, offering suggestions that he politely acknowledged but couldn't implement given the physics of the situation. Finally, Hannah had walked over, studied the problem with the serious concentration of someone solving a puzzle, and then simply crawled underneath the trunk and pushed the chair leg that was causing the obstruction. The trunk moved easily once the chair was repositioned, and Liam stood there looking at this tiny girl who had solved in 30 seconds what he had been struggling with for 20 minutes. The absurdity of the situation. A grown man defeated by furniture and rescued by a 5-year-old. Struck him all at once, and he began to laugh. Not the bitter, sardonic laughter that had been his only response to irony for the past 2 years, but genuine, surprised, delighted laughter that seemed to come from some part of him that he had thought was permanently broken. The sound was so unexpected, so completely out of character for the careful, contained man they had come to know, that Sarah and Yassel stared at him in amazement. And then Hannah, pleased with herself and infected by his amusement, began to giggle. Her laughter triggered Yassel's, and suddenly the small apartment was filled with the sound of four people who had almost forgotten what it felt like to find something genuinely funny. When the laughter finally subsided, they found themselves looking at each other with a kind of shy surprise, as if they had accidentally revealed more of themselves than they had intended. But instead of the awkwardness that might have followed such an unguarded moment between virtual strangers, there was a warmth, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. That evening, as Liam prepared to leave for work, Yassel asked if he could walk part of the way with him, just to the corner where the streetlights began. It was a small request, but Sarah saw how much it meant to both of them. To Yassel, who was starved for male attention and approval, and to Liam, who was discovering that he still had something to offer another human being. She watched from the window as they walked down the street together, the tall man shortening his stride to match the boy's pace, their heads bent together in conversation. For the first time since David's death, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that might contain something more than mere survival. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too much to hope for, but perhaps a kind of contentment, a sense of belonging somewhere to someone in this vast and often cruel city. When Liam returned in the morning, he brought with him a small wooden toy he had carved during his break at the warehouse. A horse for Hannah, crude but recognizable, sanded smooth so it wouldn't splinter her small hands. It was a gesture so simple and thoughtful that Sarah felt tears threaten, and she had to turn away to compose herself before thanking him. They were no longer just strangers sharing space out of mutual necessity. Something deeper was taking root, something that felt like the beginning of a family, though none of them would have dared to say so aloud. Part 5. Threat from the Past, 3,500 characters. 3 weeks into this fragile new arrangement, the past came knocking at their door in the form of Michel Rosati, a man whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room like a cold wind. Sarah heard his voice in the hallway before she saw him, smooth, Italian-accented, carrying the false friendliness of someone who had learned to use charm as a weapon. When Liam opened the door, Rosati pushed past him without invitation, his eyes immediately finding Sarah where she stood frozen by the stove. "Cara mia," he said, spreading his arms in a gesture of false welcome. "You look much better than when I last saw you. Good food, warm bed. This is what a woman needs, no?" His smile revealed gold teeth that caught the light like warning signals, and Sarah felt her stomach turn with recognition and fear. Rosati owned a boarding house near the docks, a place where desperate women could find shelter in exchange for work that was never clearly defined until it was too late to refuse. Sarah had spent exactly one night there after David's death, before understanding what kind of establishment it really was and fleeing with her children in the early morning darkness. She had hoped never to see Rosati again, had prayed that in a city of millions, their paths would never cross. "Mr. Rosati," she managed, her voice barely steady. "I don't know why you're here. Don't you?" He moved into the apartment like he owned it, examining the modest furnishings with the calculating eye of someone who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "You stayed in my house, you ate my food, you slept in my bed. And then you disappeared like a thief in the night, without paying what you owe." Liam stepped closer, his body language shifting in a way that Sarah had never seen before. The quiet, gentle man she had come to know was still there, but underneath she could suddenly sense the firefighter he had been, someone accustomed to walking into dangerous situations and making quick decisions about life and death. "She owes you nothing," Liam said, his voice carrying a new edge. "She was there one night, and whatever arrangement you thought you had, she didn't agree to it." Rosati laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Ah, the Irish knight comes to rescue the poor widow. How romantic. But business is business, my friend, and this woman has debts that need paying." He turned back to Sarah, his smile becoming predatory. $20 for the room, the food, the protection I provided. Plus interest, of course. Call it $50 total. The sum was staggering, more money than Sarah had seen since David's death, more than Liam made in 3 months at the warehouse. It was a deliberate trap, an impossible demand designed to force her into the only form of payment that Rosati was really interested in collecting. "I don't have that kind of money," Sarah said, though they all knew this already. "No, but you have other ways to pay." Rosati's meaning was unmistakable, and Sarah saw Yassel's eyes widen with confusion and fear as he sensed the adult tension in the room without understanding its source. Liam moved between them, his presence suddenly taking up more space than his actual size would suggest. "Get out," he said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made even Rosati take a step backward. "This is not your business, Irish. She lives here now. That makes it my business." Liam's hands were steady at his sides, but Sarah could see the coiled tension in his shoulders, the way he had positioned himself to protect not just her but the children as well. Rosati studied him for a long moment, clearly calculating odds and consequences. He was used to intimidating women and children, people who had no recourse and no protection. But Liam was something different, a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. "You think you can protect her?" Rosati asked finally. "You think your presence here changes anything? I have friends, Irish. Friends who are very good at collecting debts." "Then you better make sure those friends understand what they're walking into," Liam replied. "Because I've got friends too, and mine wear badges." It was a bluff. Sarah was almost certain it was a bluff, but it was delivered with such quiet conviction that Rosati's confidence wavered slightly. He looked around the apartment again, as if reassessing the situation, and Sarah could see him weighing the potential profit against the possible trouble. "This is not finished," he said finally, pointing a finger at Sarah. "Debts have a way of coming due, with or without your Irish protector. You remember that, Cara. You remember that nothing in this city comes without a price." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, but his presence lingered in the apartment like smoke, contaminating the sense of safety they had worked so hard to build. Hannah pressed close to Sarah's leg, not understanding what had happened but sensing the fear in her mother's body. Yassel stood near the window, watching the street as if expecting more unwelcome visitors. "Who was that man, Mama?" Hannah asked in a small voice. "Someone who made a mistake," Sarah answered, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Someone who thought we were still the people we were before we came here." But even as she spoke the words, she could see the doubt in Liam's eyes, the understanding that Rosati's threats were not empty posturing. In a city where corruption ran as deep as the sewers and justice was often just another commodity to be bought and sold, men like Rosati had many ways to collect what they believed they were owed. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Liam sat by the dying fire and talked in whispers about what might come next. The fragile peace they had built together felt suddenly precarious, threatened by forces beyond their control. But when Sarah offered to leave, to take the children and disappear again into the city's maze of tenements and alleyways, Liam shook his head. "Running didn't work the first time," he said. "Men like that, they don't forget and they don't forgive. If you run now, you'll be running forever." "Then what do we do?" Liam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the embers. "We stand our ground," he said finally. "We protect what we've built here, and we hope that when the time comes, we're strong enough to keep it." Part 6. The Siege, 3,500 characters. The attack came 3 nights later, in the hour before dawn when the city held its breath between the exhaustion of night and the promise of morning. Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, not the familiar rhythm of neighbors returning late or leaving early, but the deliberate, coordinated movement of men who had come with purpose. She lay still for a moment, hoping she was wrong, praying that her months of hypervigilance had finally betrayed her into hearing threats where none existed. But then she heard the soft scrape of metal against wood, the careful testing of their door handle, and she knew with cold certainty that Rosati had made good on his promises. She slipped from her makeshift bed on the floor and moved silently to where Liam slept, touching his shoulder gently but firmly. His eyes opened immediately, alert in the way of someone who had learned to wake ready for danger. "3 men," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "Maybe more." Liam nodded, rolling silently to his feet and reaching for the pistol he kept wrapped in oilcloth beneath his pillow. It was an old service revolver from his firefighting days, when the department had issued weapons to men who might need to protect themselves while working in the rougher parts of the city. He had hoped never to use it again, but hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. The children were still asleep in the bed, exhausted by a day of play and unaware that their small world was about to be tested. Sarah moved toward them, positioning herself between the door and their sleeping forms, her hand closing around the iron poker that stood beside the coal stove. It was a makeshift weapon, but it was solid and heavy and familiar in her grip. The first man came through the door like he expected no resistance, like this was just another collection job in a city full of people who had learned to submit rather than fight. He was big and confident and careless, and that carelessness cost him dearly when Liam's first shot caught him in the shoulder and spun him around like a child's top. The man went down hard, his pistol skittering across the floor and under the table. The second man was more cautious, staying low as he came through the doorway, but he hadn't accounted for Sarah's position beside the door. The poker caught him across the temple with all the desperate strength of a mother protecting her children, and he dropped without a sound, blood pooling beneath his head on the worn wooden planks. The third man never made it fully into the apartment. Liam's second shot took him in the chest as he tried to rush through the door, and he fell backward into the hallway with a crash that woke half the building. But even as Sarah felt a surge of fierce satisfaction, she could hear more movement on the stairs, voices calling out in Italian, the sound of running feet. "How many?" Liam asked, reloading with practiced efficiency. "I don't know," Sarah replied, but even as she spoke, she could see shadows moving in the hallway, could hear the careful whisper of men trying to coordinate their next move. Too many to fight, too many to escape from through the single door that was their only exit. That was when they heard the whistle, sharp, authoritative, the unmistakable sound of police arriving at a scene of violence. It was followed by heavy footsteps and shouted commands, the voice of authority cutting through the chaos of the moment. "Police! Everyone on the ground! Now!" Harold Washington appeared in the doorway like an answer to prayers they hadn't dared to voice. Sarah had met him only once before, when he had stopped by to check on Liam after hearing about his struggles following Bridget's death. He was one of the few black police officers in the city, a man who had earned his position through competence and courage rather than connections, and his presence in their hallway felt like salvation. Behind him came two other officers, their weapons drawn but pointed safely away from the apartment's inhabitants. The men who had been preparing to storm their refuge were face down on the floor, hands behind their heads, their moment of advantage transformed into complete defeat by the arrival of legitimate authority. "Jesus, Liam," Harold said, surveying the scene with professional calm. "When you said you might need help, I thought you meant a favor, not a war. How did you know to come?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with relief and residual fear. "Got a tip from someone who said there was going to be trouble here tonight," Harold replied, but his eyes flicked to Liam in a way that suggested there was more to the story. "Lucky thing we were in the neighborhood." Later, after the wounded men had been taken to the hospital under guard and the others had been marched off to jail, Harold stayed to take their statements and to share a cup of coffee that Sarah brewed with hands that were only slightly trembling. The children had slept through most of the violence, waking only when the apartment filled with unfamiliar voices, and they sat quietly on the bed, wide-eyed but unharmed. "Rosati's finished," Harold told them. "We've been watching him for months, waiting for him to make a mistake big enough to shut him down. Sending armed men after a family with children, that's the kind of mistake that ends careers and starts prison sentences." "What about his other friends?" Sarah asked. "He said he had connections." Harold's smile was grimly satisfied. "Had is the right word. Turns out when you're facing serious jail time, loyalty becomes a luxury most people can't afford. Rosati's been very talkative since we brought him in, very eager to share information about his business associates." As the sun rose over the Lower East Side, painting the tenement walls in shades of gold and amber, Sarah looked around their small apartment, blood-stained but intact, violated but still theirs. The children were safe, Liam was unharmed, and the threat that had hung over them like a storm cloud had finally broken and passed. Is it over? Yassel asked quietly, speaking for the first time since the violence had ended. Liam knelt beside the boy, his hands gentle on small shoulders. Yes, he said with quiet conviction. It's over. We're safe now. And for the first time since she had accepted shelter from a stranger in the fog, Sarah allowed herself to believe that safety might be more than just a temporary reprieve from danger. It might actually be something they could build on, something that could last. Part 7. Ghosts. 3,500 characters. In the quiet weeks that followed the violence, as their small apartment returned to something resembling normalcy, Sarah found herself wrestling with ghosts that had nothing to do with the men who had threatened them. There were other shadows in her past, other choices that haunted her dreams and whispered accusations in the moments before sleep. The safety that Liam had helped her build had given her something she hadn't possessed in months: the luxury of examining wounds that went deeper than mere survival. It was during one of these restless nights, when she lay listening to the steady breathing of her children and the soft sounds of Liam moving carefully around the apartment as he prepared for his shift, that she finally found the courage to speak about the daughter she had lost. Not to death, but to circumstances that felt like death, to a choice that had seemed impossible at the time and unforgivable in retrospect. There was another child, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like a confession. Liam stopped moving, his attention drawn to her words like iron to a magnet. Before Yassel and Hannah? He asked gently, settling into the chair beside where she lay, giving her his full attention in the way that had become natural between them. After Yassel, before Hannah. The words came slowly, each one weighted with 3 years of guilt and regret. A daughter, Ruth. She was born too early, too small, and David was out of work, and we already had Yassel to feed, and the doctor said she might not survive anyway, and there was this place. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say aloud that she had given away her own child, had handed a baby to strangers because keeping her had seemed impossible and losing her had seemed inevitable. The words stuck in her throat like stones, too heavy and sharp to swallow, too painful to spit out. Liam waited, not pushing, not judging, just present in the way that had made it possible for her to trust him with everything else. Finally, she continued, the words coming in a rush like blood from a wound that had been bandaged but never properly cleaned. The Sisters of Mercy had a foundling home. They said they would find her a good family, people who could provide for her properly. I told myself it was temporary, that when David found work again, when things got better, I would go back for her. But things never got better. And then David got sick, and by the time I could have... She stopped, shaking her head. I told myself she was better off. I told myself I was protecting her. How old would she be now? Liam asked quietly. 8. Same as Yassel. The parallel was not lost on either of them, that somewhere in the city, there was a girl the same age as her son, a girl who might not even know her mother's name. Do you know where she is? Sarah nodded, though the gesture was barely visible in the dim light. I've been watching, asking questions when I could. The foundling home placed her with a family in Brooklyn, but they gave her back after a year. Said she was too difficult, too willful. She's been in and out of institutions since then. The last I heard, she was at the girls' industrial home near the Navy Yard. The name hung between them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of possibility and fear in all directions. The girls' industrial home was not an orphanage in any gentle sense. It was a place where unwanted children were taught trades that would make them useful to society, where discipline was harsh and affection was considered a luxury that interfered with proper moral development. You want to find her, Liam said. It wasn't a question. I want to bring her home, Sarah replied, and the word home encompassed not just the apartment they shared but the family they had accidentally created, the sense of belonging that had grown between them like something planted in good soil. Then we'll find her, Liam said simply, as if the decision required no debate, no weighing of consequences or complications. It won't be easy. The institutions don't like to give up children they've invested time in training. And she doesn't know me, has no reason to trust me. For all she knows, I abandoned her because I didn't want her. Did you? The question was direct but not accusatory, and Sarah found herself considering it honestly for the first time in years. "No," she said finally. "I was afraid I couldn't take care of her. Afraid I would fail her the way I felt like I was failing everyone else. But I wanted her. I have always wanted her." The conversation continued in whispers as Liam prepared to leave for work, but the decision had been made in that moment of confession and commitment. They would find Ruth, would attempt to reclaim the daughter who had been lost to fear and circumstance. It would be complicated and potentially heartbreaking, but it was also an opportunity to heal a wound that had been festering in Sarah's heart for 3 years. 2 days later, they made the journey to Brooklyn, taking the ferry across the East River with Yassel and Hannah in tow. The girls' industrial home was a grim brick building that looked more like a prison than a place where children lived and learned. But inside those walls was a girl who belonged to them, who had always belonged to them, and Sarah was determined to bring her family back together. The meeting was awkward and painful in the way that reunions often are when too much time and hurt have passed between people who should have been close. Ruth was thin and wary, with Sarah's dark eyes and David's stubborn chin, and she looked at her birth mother with a mixture of curiosity and carefully controlled anger. "Why now?" she asked when Sarah tried to explain why she had come. "Why do you want me now when you didn't want me then?" It was a fair question, and Sarah answered it as honestly as she could, talking about fear and poverty and choices that had seemed necessary at the time but felt inexcusable in retrospect. She talked about David's death and their own struggles, about finding safety with Liam and wanting to share that safety with the daughter she had never stopped thinking about. Ruth listened without comment, her expression giving nothing away, but when Hannah shyly offered to share her wooden horse, the toy that Liam had carved with such care, something in the older girl's face softened slightly. The process of bringing Ruth home took weeks of paperwork and negotiations, of proving that Sarah could provide a stable environment for a child who had been labeled difficult by every institution that had housed her. But eventually, on a cold morning in March, Ruth walked out of the girls' industrial home carrying a small cloth bag that contained everything she owned in the world, and came home to a family she had never known but had always belonged to. The adjustment was not easy. Ruth was guarded and suspicious, accustomed to having her affections disappointed and her trust betrayed. But slowly, in the warmth and safety of their small apartment, she began to bloom like a plant that had been kept too long in darkness, finally brought into the light. Part 8. Quiet Happiness, 3,500 characters. Spring came to the Lower East Side like a hesitant promise, bringing with it the scent of new growth and the sound of children playing in the narrow streets between tenements. In their small apartment above the grocery store, the family that had assembled itself from pieces of broken lives began to discover what happiness might look like when it wasn't shadowed by fear or tempered by constant vigilance. Ruth's integration into their household happened gradually, like the slow healing of a wound that had been torn open too many times to trust quick remedies. She was 8 years old, but possessed the wariness of someone much older, someone who had learned early that adults made promises they didn't keep, and that safety was always temporary. But Liam's patient kindness and Sarah's persistent love began to work on her defenses like water working on stone, not through force but through constant, gentle pressure. The breakthrough came on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Ruth woke from a nightmare, crying out in her sleep for someone who couldn't answer. Sarah went to comfort her, but it was Liam who appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of a child in distress. Without asking permission or waiting for invitation, he sat on the edge of the bed and began to tell Ruth a story about a little girl who had been lost in a great forest but found her way home by following the sound of her family's voices calling her name. It was a simple story, the kind that parents tell to chase away monsters and fears, but Ruth listened with the focused attention of someone hearing something she desperately needed to believe. When the story ended, she looked at Liam with something approaching trust and asked if he would tell it again tomorrow night. He promised he would, and from that moment forward, the bedtime story became a ritual that bound them together more surely than any legal document or formal adoption ever could. Days fell into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous to people who had known too much chaos. Sarah would wake early to prepare breakfast and tend to the small tasks that kept their household running smoothly. The children would help according to their abilities, Yassel carrying water from the pump in the courtyard, Hannah setting the table with careful concentration. Ruth mending small tears in clothing with stitches that were remarkably neat for someone so young. Liam would return from his night shift as the city was waking up, tired but no longer hollow-eyed, carrying small treasures he had found or been given during his hours of solitude. A book with pictures for Hannah, who was just beginning to recognize letters. A piece of wood that could be carved into something useful for Yassel, who showed an aptitude for working with his hands. For Ruth, he brought stories, fragments of conversations he had overheard, descriptions of things he had seen during his walks through the sleeping city, small observations about the world that he offered like gifts to someone who was still learning to trust in tomorrow. The apartment itself began to show signs of their occupation, transforming from a place where a lonely man had simply existed into a space where a family actually lived. Sarah's needlework appeared on the walls, samplers with biblical verses, small embroidered pictures that brought color and warmth to rooms that had been functional but cheerless. The children's few possessions found homes in corners and on shelves, marking territory and establishing permanence in ways that went deeper than mere decoration. But perhaps the most significant change was in Liam himself. The man who had moved through the world like a ghost for 2 years began to rediscover what it meant to be fully alive. Sarah watched him playing with the children in the small courtyard behind their building, his laughter mixing with theirs as they chased each other around the single scraggly tree that somehow survived in that small patch of neglected ground. She saw him teaching Yassel to whittle, his big hands guiding small fingers as they learned to coax shapes from pieces of wood. She observed him listening to Ruth's carefully guarded stories about her time in the institutions, his face serious and attentive as she tested whether her experiences would be met with judgment or understanding. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they sat around their table sharing a meal that had been stretched to feed 5 people, but somehow felt abundant, that Ruth made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to call you Papa," she said to Liam, the words emerging with the kind of fierce determination that characterized everything she did. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." The silence that followed was not awkward but full, pregnant with the weight of everything that simple word represented. Liam looked at Sarah, seeking permission or confirmation, and found both in her tearful nod. "I would be honored," he said simply, and Ruth smiled for the first time since coming to live with them. Not the careful, guarded expression she usually wore, but a real smile that transformed her whole face and made visible the child she had always been underneath the protective armor of premature adulthood. That night, after the children were asleep and the apartment had settled into the peaceful quiet of a household at rest, Sarah and Liam found themselves sitting by the window that looked out over the street where their journey together had begun. The seasons had changed, the harsh winter giving way to the tentative warmth of spring, and with that change had come a transformation in their own lives that neither of them could have imagined when they were simply strangers offering and accepting temporary shelter. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, the question emerging from some deep need to name what had grown between them. Liam considered the question seriously, as he considered everything before answering. "I didn't think I would ever be happy again," he said finally. "I thought happiness was something that belonged to my past, something I had used up with Bridget. But this—" He gestured toward the apartment, toward the sleeping children, toward her. "This is different. Not better or worse than what I had before, but different. And yes, I think it might be happiness." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The happiness they had found together was not the bright, uncomplicated joy of people who had never known loss. It was deeper and more complex, shot through with gratitude and disbelief, tempered by the knowledge of how quickly everything could be taken away. But it was real, and it was theirs, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. Part 9. New Beginning, 3,500 characters. The wedding ring was simple. A thin band of silver that had been carefully cleaned and polished until it caught the light like captured starlight. Liam had purchased it from old Mr. Goldstein, the watchmaker who occupied the narrow shop 2 blocks from their apartment, using money he had saved by walking to work instead of taking the trolley and by eating smaller portions so the children could have more. It wasn't much by the standards of couples who could afford elaborate ceremonies and expensive gifts, but it represented something more valuable than gold. the deliberate choice to bind their lives together legally and spiritually, to make official what had already become true in their hearts. The ceremony itself took place on the rooftop of their tenement building, 5 stories above the noise and chaos of the street, with a view of the Hudson River that stretched toward horizons that suddenly seemed full of possibility. Rabbi Goldberg from the synagogue on Rivington Street had agreed to perform the marriage after long conversations with Sarah about faith and tradition, about what it meant to find love in the ruins of loss, about the ways that God sometimes answered prayers in forms we didn't expect to recognize. The guest list was small but significant. Harold Washington stood as Liam's witness, resplendent in his police uniform and grinning with genuine pleasure at seeing his friend reclaim happiness after so much sorrow. Mrs. Chun from the laundry downstairs had insisted on attending, bringing with her a traditional Chinese blessing for the couple and small red envelopes filled with coins for the children. A handful of neighbors who had watched their family form and grow over the months gathered around the edges of the ceremony, adding their presence to the sense of community celebration. But the most important witnesses were the 3 children who stood beside them as they exchanged vows. Yassel held the ring until the proper moment, his face serious with the weight of his responsibility. Hannah scattered flower petals that she had carefully collected from the small garden that some optimistic soul had planted in a wooden box on the fire escape. And Ruth stood between Sarah and Liam, one hand in her mother's, the other in her stepfather's, physically connecting the 2 adults who had chosen to make their family complete. The words they spoke were traditional but felt revolutionary in the context of their lives. Promises to love and honor and cherish, to stand together through whatever hardships might come, to build something lasting from the fragments of their individual sorrows. When Liam slipped the silver ring onto Sarah's finger, she felt something settle into place in her heart. Some part of herself that had been holding its breath for months finally exhaling in relief and joy. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful, centered around food that had been prepared communally by the women in their building. Mrs. O'Brien from the 3rd floor had contributed a pot of stew that could feed an army. The Italian widow from the 2nd floor had baked bread that filled the hallway with the scent of yeast and hope. Sarah herself had managed to acquire the ingredients for a small cake, plain but sweet, that the children decorated with berries and sugar until it looked like something from a fairy tale. As the sun set over the river, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed designed specifically for wedding celebrations, the small gathering moved from the rooftop to the O'Brien family's larger apartment, where furniture had been pushed aside to create space for dancing. An old man with a fiddle appeared from somewhere in the building's depths, and suddenly the air was filled with music that spoke of celebration and community, of the irrepressible human impulse to find joy even in the midst of struggle. Sarah danced with her new husband, feeling his arms around her as they moved to music that seemed to come from some deep well of shared cultural memory. She danced with her children, each in turn, watching their faces light up with laughter as they spun around the crowded room. She danced with Harold Washington, who surprised everyone with his grace and rhythm, and with Mr. Goldstein, who told her stories about other weddings he had witnessed in his long life in the neighborhood. But the moment that would stay with her forever came late in the evening, when the formal celebration had begun to wind down and people were starting to drift back to their own apartments and their own lives. She found Liam standing by the window that looked out over the street where they had first met, holding Hannah, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Ruth and Yassel were curled up together on the couch, exhausted by excitement and celebration, their faces peaceful in the way that only sleeping children's faces can be. "Any regrets?" she asked quietly, moving to stand beside him. "Only that it took us so long to get here," he replied, his voice soft with contentment and wonder. "Only that we wasted time being afraid of what this could become." Sarah looked around the room at the evidence of their celebration. The scattered flower petals, the empty plates, the musical instruments abandoned by musicians who had finally played themselves out. Tomorrow, they would return to their small apartment and their ordinary routines, to the daily work of building a life together. Liam would continue his job at the warehouse. Sarah would continue her sewing and mending. The children would continue growing and learning and testing the boundaries of their newly secure world. But tonight, in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of community and the promise of tomorrow, they were complete. They were a family not because circumstances had thrown them together, but because they had chosen each other deliberately and consciously, with full knowledge of what they were gaining and what they had already survived. The morning after their wedding found them in their own small kitchen, sharing coffee and planning the ordinary details of their newly official life together. But there was nothing ordinary about the way they moved around each other now, the way they shared space and decisions and dreams. They had built something worth keeping from the ruins of what they had lost, and in doing so, they had discovered that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not in moments of high drama, but in the quiet accumulation of daily choices to love and trust and hope. The children woke to find their parents, both of them officially now, making breakfast together, and in their sleepy contentment, Sarah could see the future taking shape. Not a future without challenges or sorrows, but a future where they would face whatever came as a family, bound together by something stronger than blood or law or circumstance. They were bound by choice, by love deliberately given and gratefully received, by the radical decision to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their individual stories. Outside their window, the city continued its relentless motion, but inside their small apartment, time seemed to slow and deepen, making space for the kind of happiness that grows slowly and lasts forever.